Booleans are another type of value in JavaScript. But Booleans are special because there are only two Boolean values, true and false. Let's click in the script element and type true. Press enter and type false. So these are the only two Boolean values that exist, true and false. So what's the purpose of Boolean values? A Boolean value represents whether something is true or false. For example, in JavaScript, we can compare two numbers. Let's create some new lines and type the code 3 less than 5. So this code checks whether the number 3 is less than 5. And of course, this is true. So if we console.log this code, console.log, and save, and then go to our website and open the console, right-click, inspect, and console, it will show us that the result of this code is the Boolean value true. Let's try another example. Let's delete this less than symbol and replace it with a greater than symbol. So now this code checks whether 3 is greater than 5. And we know that 3 is not greater than 5. So if we save, the computer will tell us that the result of this comparison is the Boolean value false. So as you can see, a Boolean value represents whether something is true or false. Now let's learn the syntax rules for Booleans. To create a Boolean, we just type true or false. Note that we don't surround these with quotes like this. If we surround them with quotes, this is now a string, not a Boolean. We can use type of to check this. So at the front, we can type console.log type of true. If we save, this will tell us that this is a string. Now, if we remove the quotes and save, this will tell us that this is now a Boolean. So when creating a Boolean, don't put quotes around true or false. Let's save. Now, one way to create a Boolean is to compare two numbers. For example, 3 greater than 5. So this greater than symbol is called a comparison operator. And there are many other comparison operators we can use. We saw less than earlier, and we also have greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, triple equals, which checks if two values are equal to each other, and exclamation double equals, which checks if two values are not equal to each other. Now, JavaScript is a little special because it has two ways to check if two values are equal, triple equals and double equals. The difference is that double equals tries to convert both values into the same type. For example, in our code, let's create some new lines and console.log, and let's check if the number 5 is equal to the string 5.00. If we save, it will tell us that these two values are equal to each other, even though one of them is a number and the other is a string. And that's because the double equals converts both values into the same type. So it converts both of these into the number 5 and then compares them. So that's why they are equal. However, this is not a good idea because this value is a number and this value is a string. It's a piece of text. So they shouldn't really be equal to each other. That's why in JavaScript, we always use the triple equals to check if two values are the same, so that we avoid the conversion behavior of double equals. So if we save, now it will tell us that these two values are not equal to each other because one value is a number and the other value is a string. So this rule also applies to not equal to. In JavaScript, we always use exclamation double equals instead of exclamation equals to avoid the conversion behavior. All right, so those are comparison operators. In the order of operations, comparison operators have a lower priority than math. So if we did something like 5 and then minus 5, this would calculate 5 minus 5 first, which is 0, and then compare the two numbers. So 3 is now greater than 0. So if we save, the first comparison will now be true. So comparison operators have a lower priority than math operators. Now that we know what Boolean values are, we're going to combine them with a really useful feature called if statements. An if statement lets us write multiple groups of code and then decide which code to run. Let's do an example and create our first if statement. We're going to go to the bottom and create some new lines and type if and open bracket, close bracket, and open curly bracket, closed curly bracket. Between these round brackets, we're going to put a Boolean value like true. And in between the curly brackets, we're going to put some code to run. For example, console.log hello. So the way that an if statement works is that if this Boolean value is true, then we're going to run the code in the curly brackets. If this Boolean value is false, then we're not going to run the code. If we save, the value between the brackets is true, so we're going to run this code and display hello. Now if we change this to false and save, it will not run this code. So an if statement lets us decide whether or not to run some code based on this Boolean value. Now if statements have another useful feature called else. Let's go to the end of this if statement and type else, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And then inside these curly brackets, we're going to put some different code like console.log else. The way else works is if this Boolean value is true, the computer will run this code. Otherwise, we will run the code inside else. Let's give it a try. We'll change this Boolean value to true and save. And because it is true, it will run this code and display hello. Now, if this Boolean value is false and save, because it is false, it will not run this code and it will run the code inside else and display else. So using if and else, we can write two groups of code and then decide which code to run. Now let's do a practical example. We're going to write some code to check if someone is old enough to drive. Let's go to the bottom and create some new lines. And we're going to type if, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside here, we're going to compare two numbers. The first number is a person's age. Let's pretend we have a person who is 30 years old. So we're going to type 30. Then we're going to check if this age is greater than or equal to the legal driving age. Let's pretend the legal driving age is 16. Notice that between the brackets, we don't have to just put a Boolean value. We can put any code that results in a Boolean value. So this comparison results in the Boolean value true. That means the computer will run the code between the curly brackets. So in here, let's type console.log you can drive. Now, if this is not true, let's run some different code. At the bottom, we'll type else and curly brackets, and then inside these brackets, we'll type console.log you cannot drive. Now let's save, and it will tell me that this person who is 30 years old can drive. If we go back and change this to a person that is 15 years old and save, this comparison will result in false. So it will display you cannot drive. So that's how we use if statements. We can write multiple groups of code for different situations and then decide which code to run. Now let's learn the syntax rules for if statements. To create an if statement, we type if, and then round brackets with a Boolean value inside. This is called the condition. If this condition is true, we will run the code inside the curly brackets. We can also add an else statement. This code will run if the condition is false. The else statement is optional. We don't have to have one. So these curly brackets and the code inside, these are called branches because it's like a tree branch. The code is splitting off into two directions, and we either run this code or we run this code. One more thing to know is in a branch, if we only have one line of code, the curly brackets are actually optional. So we can delete these and the code will still work. However, if we have more than one line of code in this branch, for example, if we add another line, console.log, congrats, now this branch has two lines of code, so the curly brackets are mandatory. So we have to add them back. Now we're going to learn another feature of if statements, which is we can have more than one condition. For example, we're going to go to the end of this if branch and type else if, and then brackets and curly brackets. Else if lets us add another branch to our if statement. Between these round brackets, we can add another condition. For example, if a person is almost old enough to drive, let's display a different message. So inside this condition, let's check if this person's age, which is 15, is greater than or equal to 14. So we're checking if they are almost old enough to drive. And now inside the curly brackets, we're going to display a different message. Console.log almost there. So the way this works is that the if statement checks the conditions one by one. First, it checks if this is true. If it is, it will run this branch. Then it checks if this is true. If it is, it will run this branch. And if none of the conditions are true, it will run the else branch. So here, this condition is false, so we're not going to run this code. But now the second condition is true, so we're going to run this code. If we save, we display almost there in the console. So using else if branches, we can add as many conditions as we want to an if statement. The next thing we're going to learn is that we can combine if statements with variables from the previous lesson. For example, here we wrote the person's age 2 times. So we can actually save this age in a variable and then reuse that value. So above the if statement, let's create a variable using const, and let's name this variable age, and we'll make it equal to 15. Remember, the best practice for creating a variable is to use const by default, and only use let if we're going to change this value later. And now that we've saved this number in a variable, we can use the variable inside the if statement. So we'll replace 15 with age, and here as well with age. So this will take whatever value is inside the variable and substitute it into the code. If we save, the if statement works the same way as before, and we run this line.